So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Neil Lewis. And Neil's an associate professor in communication, medicine, and public policy. He received his BA from Cornell and a doctorate in the University of Michigan. He's also the Nancy and Peter Marnick Family Investigator in Life Sciences at Cornell here and at Weill Cornell Medicine. He's co-founder and co-director, the Action Research Collaborative, and associate director for the Center for Racial Justice for Equitable Futures. Neil describes himself as a behavioral scientist who studies motivational, behavioral, and equity implications of social interactions and politics. And he's particularly interested in researching science to improve education, health, and environmental outcomes for individuals and societies. Has been awarded many prestigious awards, including 3 early career awards. He's written over 100 scholarly articles, and he has considerable media presence in The Atlantic, 538.org, and NPR, and other places. So let's welcome Dr. Neil Lewis.
See this. Can you all hear me? Okay, is this working? Can you all hear me in the back? Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation, and to all of you for joining in person. And I know there's some folks joining online as well. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with you about this topic. It's actually been a while since I've been asked to talk about the environmental research that we do over the past few years. People have been more interested in the health work that we've been doing a lot for understandable reasons since there's a pandemic. But even though climate change has sort of fallen out of the headlines lately, it's still really important. And so I'm glad to have this opportunity to get back to thinking about what we can do about this climate crisis that we're in. So, some of the questions I've been thinking about and that I want to talk about today are, what can we be doing as scholars in the variety of disciplines in which we're studying and working? How can we engage in productive dialogue about environmental issues with multiple communities and stakeholders that will inevitably be affected by this? And what might be the implications of those efforts? So those are some of the things I've been thinking about and that I want to talk about today. Before I dive into the substance of the research, though, I want to start off by telling you a bit how and why I wanted to do this work, because I think that'll provide a useful lens for understanding the research approaches that I'll talk about throughout this work. So when I was a brand new graduate student, so I left here finishing undergrad and went to Michigan to be a grad student. And when I got there, I was initially trying to figure out, well, what should I study? And so I had a number of conversations with my advisors at the time about this question, asked them how they figured out what they studied. And one of them had a particularly good piece of advice on this question. It stuck with me since, and I'll share with you now. And his name was Frank Yates. He was one of my PhD mentors. Unfortunately, we lost him in 2020, but Frank had spent his entire career studying decision. So it seemed like a reasonable person to ask, how should I make this decision about what to do with that? And so I asked Frank, how do you decide what to study? And he said, it's very simple. Study the things that keep you up. Then if you do that, that'll be a way to keep you motivated to keep doing your research, keep finding ways to have an impact, and so forth. And that's something that has stuck with me along the way. These days, there are many things that keep me up at night. But one that was keeping me up at night even back then, and that continues to, is this issue of climate change and other sustainability-related issues. I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit with this audience. If you're taking this class, presumably you're also concerned about this. But when I see reports out of the IPCC and elsewhere, I do worry about what might happen to us now and in the future. I worry not just because of abstract intergovernmental reports, but also because of concrete experiences that we've already begun to feel. So some of you might remember this from a few summers ago. We had some wildfires a bit north of us in Canada that got so extreme that they blanketed the eastern half of the United States, including right here right now. So this was wildfire maps from and the smoke maps from 2 summers ago. When I live downtown Ithaca, I have an air quality sensor at my house, and this is what it was showing me during that period, right? This longer period in which the air quality, even here in a place that's considered a climate haven, stayed in the unhealthy ranges for a while. One of the graduate students whose dissertation committee I was on at the time actually had a dissertation defense scheduled during that time, during those days. And you'll notice in this picture the being masked up for that defense. We were masked up that day, not because of COVID, but because the smoke got so bad in a Cornell building, right, where this dissertation defense is being held, that the filtration system was having difficulty keeping up. And at one point, officials came around and were like, you all need to fire this up and get out of here because the building wasn't safe to be in anymore. But what we experienced then, although it was bad, it's certainly not the last time things like this will happen. And that's something that worries me. It's something I think about a fair amount. But what's been interesting is that even though I'm worried about this, and I assume many of the people in this room and the people joining online are worried about these things, turns out not everyone's that worried about this or really wants to engage much with this topic. So Gallup, the polling firm, they've been doing surveys of the American public on this every 2 years, going back to 2001, surveying the American public about their views on climate change and seeing how it's changed over time. And what we've seen is they've sort of stabilized the past couple of years, where about 62, the last one was done in 2023, so they'll be doing another one sometime this year. What we see is that the most recent data, about 62% of Americans believe in anthropogenic climate change. But even among those, only about 39% are really worried about it. So, although there's great scientific consensus about this issue, and scientists are very worried about this, there's a sizable share of the American public that still doesn't believe in climate change. And even among the believers, this is one thing I've been interested in, even among believers, it's not a high priority. So that's one thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. So, researchers who've been studying this for a long time, studying even with the focus on the believers, tend to find that among those who believe in climate change, it's not considered an urgent problem. They rather take this wait and see approach. So let's just see what happens, then we'll deal with it if it gets really bad. They often perceive it as this distant problem that doesn't have many concrete consequences. So, they think of it as something that'll be a big problem long in the future, and it'll be a problem for people who are far away in other countries, but it's not as big of a problem for people here. One of the really interesting things about that finding is in every country that you find that people say that, oh, it's a problem for other countries, not for us. So this is an interesting thing in how people represent this issue. And another key point on this is that this is not just because lack of education or numeracy, the ability to understand numbers. So there's this notion that, well, if we just educate people more, that will be enough. As I'll show you even some data in a little bit, people with high levels of education still have this sort of approach to thinking about and perceiving this issue. So after seeing patterns like this over and over again in some of our own data and papers in the literature, one of the first things that I did with some colleagues from Michael Hall and Pete Ellsworth was conduct a study that was designed to try and understand, well, what's going on in people's minds as they're thinking and experiencing this issue. We wanted to understand, well, how much variability is there in people's climate change beliefs? What factors are associated with those beliefs, and what are the consequences of these individual beliefs? So, this is what I just said. So we, designed a study to really try and answer those three things. And so we did a longitudinal study to get at these questions, right? So we conducted the study to examine how Americans are thinking about climate change and the implications of those thoughts over time, and looked at a variety of outcomes with that. And to do this, we recruited an online sample of American adults for the study. We had 600 people in this first study. And what we did was we surveyed those people 7 times, so about every 2 months, every 8 weeks over the course of a year. So we could follow these thoughts over time, behaviors over time, and see if these things end up being associated. One of the reasons for looking over time in this way was that there was some indication that people's beliefs in climate change and what they might want to do about it might vary a bit depending on the time of year. So in fact, a few months before we launched the study that I'm walking through, this actually happened in Congress.
By cable.
Of national attention, and in case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
So in August, there was a big snowstorm in DC in 2014, and so on the floor of Congress, there's this question about whether this really is about climate change. You know, we thought as well, climate change is about things getting hot. Look, we have this really cold, unseasonably cold weather with a snowstorm, and DC, like this raises some questions about whether this climate change phenomenon is real. So there's this sense that some people might have more skeptical views of climate change, say in the winter when it's cold and in the summer when it's hot. So we wanted to capture a full year of data to see how much there was to that. So that's one of the other reasons we did longitudinal approach. So say a bit more about the sample. We ended up with a sample that was geographically representative of the US. So people live all over the country. Sounds like this might have gone up. And let's switch to the other one. Yeah, probably all good. That works. Okay. So we had a sample that was geographically represented. We had people all over the US. We were able to know this by matching where people were living to census and Department of Agriculture data to know this. But there are a couple other things to know about the sample. It is not politically representative. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Nor was it racially representative of the country. And I'll come back later in the talk to why those things might matter. A few other quick methodological points related to what I was saying earlier. This is a pretty well-educated sample, right? So the people that participated, most of them had at least some college experience. It was also a sort of youngish sample. Someone still in my 30s, I'm going to claim early 30s is still youngish. But these are some of the characteristics of the people we studied. Before I get to results, a couple other things to keep in mind. With longitudinal studies, you always have to worry about this issue of retention. So will people come back over time? And are the people who come back different or not than the people who dropped out? And when we looked at that, we had pretty good retention for longitudinal design. So 73% of our participants from time 1 to time 2 returned, and it sort of maintained stable after that. About 70% response rate across the rest, with about half of the people completing every single time frame. And so that's important to know for analysis purposes. So we have all these people that we've surveyed, many times over the course of the year, asking about their beliefs, asking about a variety of other outcomes. To figure out what's going on with them, we ended up using something called latent class growth analysis to analyze this data. And what that does is it allows you to examine whether there are basically different kinds of people in your data, right? So are there different trajectories and beliefs? Are there different trajectories in other outcomes and so forth? And what we found is 3 clusters of people in this data. And we ended up calling them the highly concerned, the cautiously worried, and the skeptics. And so you'll see the highly concerned is the group that you see across the top. That's 387 out of the 600. The cautiously worried is another 157, and the skeptics was a relatively small group, but a group of 56 people. And so what you see across these trajectories is there is this significant but small quadratic trend that even among the believers, they believe a little less in January than they do in July. Small effect, but it's there. That's more pronounced among the cautiously worried group, which their levels of beliefs are a bit lower, but still relatively high. And then there are the skeptics who sort of started kind of in the middle where they're not really sure and became sort of less convinced over time. So those are the 3 groups that we found. But we weren't just interested in people's beliefs. We were also interested in their behaviors. And so we asked about people's sustainable behaviors over the course of the year. And there's one thing to know about the relationship between beliefs and behavior. It's a bit complicated. And there's lots of, those of you who are in the more social science majors, this might have come up in some of your methods classes. But the gist is that beliefs matter for some kinds of behaviors in some situations. There are a variety of moderators of this relationship. So it's worth looking again at this in the context of climate change to figure out what's going on. So that's one of the reasons we did this in this study. So to investigate this, the relationship between beliefs and behaviors, we measured a variety of outcomes because there are a few different possibilities that we could imagine happening. On one hand, if climate change isn't real, then there's no need to do anything. Right? If you don't believe it's real, then you really shouldn't be engaging in sustainable behaviors. That's one possibility. Another possibility is it might be real, but doesn't require anything, any action, right? So you can believe in something, but not think you need to do anything about it. And a third possibility we thought about at the time was, well, it might be real, and somebody should do something about it, but not me, right? And so we measured items in ways that allow us to tease apart these possibilities. So this question is, how much do people's beliefs map onto these different kinds of outcomes? Here's how we looked at that. So we had a set of individual behaviors that we asked people over time. How often are you doing things like recycling, using public transportation, buying eco-friendly products when they're available, using reusable shopping bags, and so forth. And they could give us that information. We also asked about another set of things, looking at things like policy support. So how supportive are you of things like reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, regulating carbon dioxide, increasing fuel efficiency standards, gas taxes, redirecting fossil fuel subsidies to renewable energy, and so forth. So these ended up clustering in these 2 sort of categories. We have the individual behaviors and then the policy support kinds of items. So the question is, how much do beliefs predict anything? Do they predict anything at all? The answer is yes and no. We found that belief in climate change predicted policy support, but it did not predict individual level behaviors. Right. So our respondents who believed climate change is real wanted the government to do something about it, but they were not necessarily behaving more sustainably themselves. And so that's a pattern we found in our sample, and others have since replicated these patterns in other studies. So there seems to be this sort of trend that individual climate change beliefs don't seem to drive individual behaviors as much as we initially thought. A real world example of this that hits close to home at a university is the fact that Academics are some of the people with the highest levels of beliefs in climate change, and yet spend a lot of time jet setting around it, right? And that's something that's come up even here in discussions at Cornell. I was on the University Sustainability Council for a number of years, and the university has made great progress in a number of domains. So food waste is down, the buildings have gotten more efficient, and so forth. But one thing that's been really hard to move is this travel issue, right? It accounts for a large share of our carbon impact. And we're not unique in this regard. I'm not picking on Cornell or academics in general. I mentioned this as just one example of this broader point that efforts to get people to believe in climate change seem to not be enough on their own, as those beliefs are not necessarily translating into sustainable behaviors. And again, we're not the only ones finding things like this. There's a meta-analysis that was published a couple of years ago, looking at a bunch of different studies on this, and finds the same conclusions that individual beliefs are rarely translating into climate-friendly behaviors. So what I've shared so far is sort of where I started with the environmental research. We're studying how individuals were thinking about environmental issues and the relationship between those thoughts and their behaviors and policy purposes. But then I didn't really know what to do with that for a while. The beliefs not leading to action was a bit dispiriting, to be frank, and I got hung up on that for a while. But then I looked back at the findings and realized there's actually something really hopeful in them. People wanted policy changes, right? That's not nothing, right? The desire for policy change makes a lot of sense also when you think about the scope of the problem. But if you pay attention to policy and politics, you know that wishing for policy changes to happen doesn't make them magically happen. If you want policy change, you need to know something about how collectives work, how groups of people think and behave. For people who do care, who are concerned, who do they think shares their concerns that they might work with in order to try and bring about these changes? One of the things we know from prior research on collective action is that if you can accurately predict who is on your side when you're trying to mobilize for change, then you can end up building larger, more powerful coalitions to push for change. But if you misperceive others, right, then you miss out on opportunities for collective action. And so that's where the next set of work sort of took us. At the time that I was thinking about this issue, my colleagues who became collaborators had just published this really fascinating paper about how Americans perceive the environmental concerns of a variety of social groups. So for this paper, they conducted a nationally representative survey of the American public, in which they asked Americans, how much do you think each of the following groups that you see across the x-axis, how concerned do you think these people are about the environment? What they found is this. So when you ask this perception question, what you find is Americans tend to think that white people, young people, and women are really concerned about the environment, but racial minorities and poor people, not so much. So that's the perception. Study didn't end there, though. You can actually ask all the people in all of these groups, purposefully sample them to see what happens, and they did this, and found that reality ran counter to these perceptions. That the highest levels of environmental concern in the United States are among racial minorities and low income. And this is something that we've now replicated multiple times in follow-up studies. Now, to understand what's going on here, it's helpful to go back and think about another Cornellian, Yuri Brunner, and his ecological systems model. Those who in human ecology might have heard about this a time or two in classes. So decades ago, when Yuri was here as a professor, he wrote about the importance of remembering that individuals are nested in broader social systems, and that those systems affect how they make meaning of the world. So this framework turns out to be quite useful for understanding what's going on in the graph I just showed you, right? For understanding why people are misperceiving each other and why that matters for our ability to collectively work together to make progress on climate change. To be more concrete, what I mean is that demographers have shown that even in modern times, our country is still segregated in some really ways. So to give you one example, this is a map of southeastern Michigan, where I was when I started studying these issues. And this map is created with data from the US Census, which shows where people are living. And there are versions of this that you can find all across the US. But in southeastern Michigan, you have neighborhoods that look like this. So the southeastern quadrant of the city, you have predominantly Black neighborhoods, an Asian neighborhood, enclave, Hispanic neighborhood. You go north, you cross 8 Mile Road, it's a real place, and you move into white suburbs. You go west towards Ann Arbor, get the same kind of thing. Well, this kind of segregation also matters for people's environmental experiences, right? And it's not just in Michigan, you see versions of these maps sort of everywhere in the US. It matters because environmental hazards and so forth are not distributed equal in space. And some of this might have come up in this class, but one thing that we know is when we think about where to put the chemical plants, the landfills, the other hazards, they tend to go in the low-income neighborhoods and the minority neighborhoods and so forth. And these things matter for how people end up thinking about these issues and experiencing these issues. It creates the situation in which there are some groups that live in safe, healthy neighborhoods, and other groups that tend to live in or near what environmental sociologist Ursula Taylor calls toxic communities, right? So they're the ones who have the landfills placed near their neighborhoods, have the highways get put through the neighborhood, and so forth. Well, the way our minds work, the situated nature of cognition, is such that these bigger policy decisions end up entering the mind and make these hazards very salient for some groups and less salient for other groups. And so that's part of what you're seeing in the graphs I showed you a few slides ago. But it's not just direct exposure to environmental hazards that matters. There's another set of processes that matter too, right? For how people end up thinking about their and other people's environmental concerns. Another thing that segregation does is it affects who you meet, who you get to know, and the kinds of information you end up learning as a result. And we can do this, we can see this by looking at things like social networking. One of the things I've been interested in my entire career is people's social networks. And by that, I'm not talking about TikTok, Facebook, or other Silicon Valley overlords. I mean, in day-to-day life, who becomes friends with whom, what information do they share, and so forth. Well, when you look at American social networks, what you see is divisions that mirror the same kind of neighborhood level segregation that I just showed you before. And there's a fascinating study from a few years ago that was recently replicated that illustrates this phenomenon quite well. So to explain what those researchers found, imagine for scaling purposes that the average American has 100 friends. Makes the math easier to think about what's going on in the study. Well, when you look at the demographic makeup of those friend groups, what you'll find is that, if this thing will work, for the average white American, 91 of those friends will also be white. They have friends. Sure, this is what we did to keep track. One Latino friend, one Asian friend, one Mexican friend, and so forth. But you see the same thing in every other country. So for the average Black American, 83 of their friends would be Black, 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, and so forth. So this is another thing that segregation does. It reshapes our networks. So these places where we're living, they affect who we meet, who we get to know, but that also affects who's coming to mind for us as we're thinking about social issues, including the environmental ones. And that's one of the implications that we've been studying over the years. It affects our ability to get perspectives from other people, to learn how they're thinking about these issues. There's been lots of research over the year on perspective taking. You've heard this phrase, perspective taking. The more recent research has been suggesting that perspective taking matters less than perspective getting. That is, going out, meeting, talking, interacting with people who are different to you. That is what really improves our ability to both understand what others are thinking, but also our ability to work together to address big issues. So These broader set of processes are why you see differences in both the actual levels of concern as well as the perceptions of concerns. The people who live near hazards are more concerned than the people who don't. But because these neighborhoods are segregated and so forth, if you don't live near the hazards, you probably also don't know anyone who does, right? And so you're not talking to those people, they're not in your friendship network, so you wouldn't even know that they're concerned to begin with. And because you don't know that, you're less willing to go out and try to work with them to push for larger change. So that's part of what's happening. The other thing is the media is not going to help either. Normally, when you don't have direct exposure to information, you get it through mediated sources. But that's unlikely in this case because of how our media infrastructure operates, right? So our mass media outlets in the US, they're not particularly diverse institutions themselves. And researchers have found that that matters for what stories do and do not get told. So there's a sociologist, Laura Garbs, who's been studying things like public radio stations, NPR and other places. And she has found that the editors and producers at these stations have this imagined audience that they tailor their stories for. And that imagined audience is this highly educated, well-off white audience. And it makes sense why they think that. That's mostly who's donating to them in their fundraising drives. But because of the perception of that audience, it affects what stories get told and how they're told, right? The shows end up being framed in ways that are not too controversial for that imagined audience. And that sort of pressure restricts what journalists can talk about. And it's one of the reasons they end up downplaying stories about environmental injustices. So this is another reason you're less likely to learn about some of these things. It's not just because of the direct exposure, but it's also because of what's happening in the media ecosystem. This is one of the reasons, there's been lots of stories about the whitewashing of environmental movements, and why this ends up affecting why we end up thinking of environmental issues as just things that white people care about. That's what the media features, so it makes sense that people think that. The media is not spending nearly as much time telling the stories of environmentalists of color who are talking about environmental injustice and so forth. There was a really egregious case of this a couple years ago at the Associated Press. Some of you might have seen this. They ran this story about young climate activists who are really pushing for change. And the original version of the story published this photo. So this is the broader group for this. They actually cropped out the one activist group and written the story that way. Greta thankfully spoke up and so forced them to correct it. But if Greta hadn't spoken up, that iteration would have stayed in the story. And the broader point here is that things like this happen, and media coverage is another thing that ends up affecting how we perceive these issues and the people involved in them. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it because it has really big implications for collective action. One of the things that we've been studying in my lab, both in the past and in our ongoing studies, is how these forces that lead us to misperceive one another end up affecting our willingness to work together. In part because of how group dynamics work in societies, people are often monitoring their surroundings, trying to figure out who they can trust, who they can work with, and so forth. So if you end up in a situation in which you think, we're not really seeing eye to eye on this, I don't really think you care about this issue as much as I do, then you're not going to go through the effort required to try and work together, right? And it's going to be very difficult to build coalitions. And this is something we've been seeing in the environmental realm in particular. One of the big consequences of these misperceptions about which groups are and are not concerned about environmental issues is that when we have these misperceptions, it ends up eroding social trust in society. The very kinds of social trust that's essential for facilitating coalition building across groups and collective action to address climate change. But that's something that we as scholars have to think about, in our own work, because the way that we approach the work, including the research that we do on campuses like this, can directly affect people's perceptions and these downstream consequences for society. So that's one of the things we've been very mindful of in our lab and in our collaborations. It's one of the reasons that we've been putting a lot of effort over the years into recruiting members of communities that have historically been ignored in this kind of research, so that we can really understand and document their perspectives on these issues. So we've been building community partnerships with organizations throughout the state of New York as well as across the country to recruit participants from groups and places that are typically excluded and ignored in the research process. One of the things we have is a mobile research lab. That's what that truck is on the screen. And that mobile research lab enables us to bring research participants on communities to study their experiences, including climate-related ones, in the very places where we live, play, and work. So the reason we're doing this is not everyone can come to campus here, right? It's kind of remote if you think about it. And because of that, we miss out on a lot of people and perspectives if all the research is centered here on campus, right? So one of the things that we do is we bring the lab to people, to community centers, to farmers market. This is one of the days we're doing recruitment at the farmers market in New York City. This is a community center project that I'll go into more in a moment. Wherever people are, we do the research there. And that has allowed us to study different kinds of people than you can typically get on a campus like this. And so doing the research in this way has enabled us to get a richer understanding of people, their contexts, and how those things combine to affect environmental engagement in a variety of ways. As we've done this, as we have diversified the samples of people we've studied, we've also learned that it's important to then think more carefully about issues of measurements, right? So sometimes you have to then develop more inclusive measures than you might have used before, than have existed in the literature. So earlier I showed you the figure highlighting that racial minorities and Latinos in particular have the highest levels of environmental concern in the US. That's something we wanted to explore a bit more in some follow-up research. And so in one project, we partnered with some community organizations in San Antonio, Texas, which is a majority Latino city, and conducted a qualitative study with people there to dig deeper and get a big, richer understanding of their experiences. So in those focus groups, we asked people, what are the most important environmental issues to you? This is something we wanted to get a better understanding of. So in their answers, they told us things like air pollution and green space. Those are environmental issues that came up. And those come up in lots of studies. But they also told us some other things that are really important environmental issues. Those things included racism and poverty, which are things that don't come up in lots of other studies. So, they brought up these things and explained how and why they see those issues as fundamentally environmental issues, walking through how that affects their ability to have access to green space, how it affects the air pollution in their neighborhood relative to other neighborhoods, and so forth. These are not issues that typically come up in environmental studies with college students, which is where lots of research is done. But we ended up learning in a series of follow-up studies that they're often top of mind issues for other communities, which suggests that we as researchers might have to rethink some of our measurement techniques as we diversify our sets. The other thing that stood out in that process was just how salient differences in life experiences were to our participants. So when we asked them about the important environmental issues to them, they told us what was most important to them, but they also spontaneously noted the differences between their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods in their cities. So they said things like, somebody from the north side would probably say fracking, right? So just the way that the segregation maps work in that city, that's a way of talking about, well, the rich people who live in a different neighborhood might be complaining about this other issue. So this spontaneously came up without us asking about it. After hearing those themes, all right, in the qualitative study, we followed up that work by conducting larger scale survey research and found that this was not unique to that context, right? That when we ran a larger study studying Americans from across the country, we found this pattern over and over again, that it turns out that race, ethnicity, and social class matter more generally for how Americans are thinking about environmental issues. So the connection between these issues matters a lot. And that's something that as scientists, we have to consider in our designs and analyses and so forth. If we want to have a more holistic understanding of environmental attitudes or other issues, we may actually have to measure different things as we diversify our sample. We have to measure things that more diverse groups of people think and care about to know how to build the kinds of coalitions that are necessary to address what's fundamentally a large and collective problem. Doing this well, though, requires not just using quantitative and experimental methods that we tend to favor in the sciences. I love those methods. I teach quantitative research methods. I'm an experimentalist by training. But it also sometimes requires doing more qualitative work, right? Getting out of the lab, going out and talking to people. That can end up improving some of our inferences. And, I will acknowledge that some of that might sound hard, and yes, it might take more work, but there are a few reasons that I think it's worth doing. And that's where I want to end with our discussion today. One of the things that I've been thinking about over the past few years is what are the implications of this work that we do, or what happens when we don't do this work? And this paper that's on the screen is one of the papers that's been very helpful for thinking about these kinds of trade-offs. It's a paper by an environmental psychologist, a team of environmental psychologists, Ken Brick and others, which highlights what can happen when we aren't willing to do that work, right? When we omit really critical perspectives from the way that we produce knowledge in science and elsewhere, and how we talk about knowledge. So Cameron and colleagues note that in the environmental realm, we sometimes forget that our analyses that suggest taking a particular action will reduce risks for one group might have unintended consequences for other groups. And the reason we forget that is because we don't study those other groups, right? And I'll show you a few examples of this. One of the examples that they focused on in the paper is this policy in the UK that's a policy designed to get rid of diesel and gasoline cars by 2040. So lots of policies like this being rolled out. So, on its face, reasonable sounding policy. The goal is to reduce health and environmental risks associated with air pollution from these cars and trucks. So policy seems quite good and reasonable if you're someone living in the UK. What we often don't talk about with policies like this is that it drives up demand for things like lithium ion batteries containing cobalt and other minerals that are mined elsewhere in the world, so in the Congo and so forth. Some of the studies into the supply chain of this have noted some of the human rights costs of these policies. So policy will surely save European lives, but estimates from United Nations and other agencies suggest that it will increase health risks and environmental damage for people living in the Congo and other countries where these minerals come from. This, by the way, is one of the big challenges with the electrification movement that we're in the midst of here in the US and other wealthy nations. There's this recent report finding that because of the United States and Western Europe alone, there's been a 20-fold increase in demand for raw materials required to produce all the electric stuff that we need to buy. So think about electric cars and all these other things. But that has led to a lot of exploitation of people in poorer countries to get those materials that are needed to make the things that we want to buy, right? And that's something we should think about. In our society, in our media, in our policies, we mostly just talk about the benefits of these things, right? What are all the benefits of electrification? We don't talk that much about the costs because we're not the ones facing them. But that is part of what increases some of the divisions between people in societies, right? And makes collective action hard. When we only think and talk about our benefits, but not how they might cost others, we don't act in ways that can make those benefits more mutual and offset some of the costs that others face. And because of that, instead of bringing people together for collective action, we end up breeding resentment instead, resentment between groups. And this happens between countries, but it also happens between groups within the same countries, as research from our own state has highlighted. To give a local example, here in New York, we've been dealing with our own version of this problem as we've been trying to figure out some of the renewable energy transition plans. One of the things that sustainability scholars have figured out is, for things like solar panels to be useful as a renewable energy tool, it's often efficient to set up these big solar farms. There's a scaling issue that you all probably talk more about in this class. Well, to do this, you often need to put these, in these large fields and places that have good access to sunlight. But large, swaths of land are hard to come by in some places in the state. We have lots of that up here in central New York, for instance, but there's less land to go around, say, in New York City. So, there have been all these questions about, well, if we're going to do this, where are we going to do it, and so forth. And, upstate New York has been sort of chosen as a place to do some of this work. But there's been quite a bit of opposition from people who live upstate. And a team here at Cornell ran a study to try and figure out why that is. There was some speculation that, well, maybe it's because, rural people just don't believe in climate change as much, or they're less educated, or, they're more conservative. Those were some of the hypotheses for opposition to these kind of solar farm projects. But it turns out that that's not what was driving it. That's not what mattered. What did matter was the distribution of benefits and costs, right? The strongest reason for opposition was the sense that people here in upstate New York were being burdened by having to build solar farms in our land and having that power sent downstate to power Manhattan without adequate sort of compensation for that. People here like the idea, right, of solar energy and the transition away from fossil fuels. What they don't like is, once again, having to bear the costs for the benefits of rich people downstate. So there's not enough local benefits for it to feel worthwhile. It feels like another form of exploitation. And so these dynamics are things that we have to think about when we're coming up with these policies, when we're trying to influence what different groups of people do. These kinds of things happen all the time. Our policies often have disparate impacts, but we're often not studying the people who are most adversely affected by those policies and what they think of them, right? That's something that weighs on me a lot, and that I think about as we do our own work. We do our research in the ways that we do for two reasons. One, from a purely scientific perspective, we often don't know how well our models of behavior hold up with other samples and other settings. And so studying these processes in the ways that we do, out in the world with different kinds of people is a valuable scientific contribution in its own way. But there's a second sort of more ethical reason that we take this approach. And that is, if scientific knowledge will continue to lay the foundation for the policies that we set in society, and to be clear, I think it should. You can talk about the fact that not everyone thinks that anymore, but I do think we should still have science informing policy. But what that means then is that that knowledge ought to include the broader base of people that will be affected by it. And that second point is something that's come up quite vividly many times as we've done this work. So as we've gone out into communities to conduct our research, many of our participants have thanked us for coming and allowing them to participate in our studies. And I'll admit, I initially found it a little bit odd. I started my career studying college students and college campuses. And the ending interaction with students with these studies is often whatever my extra credit we posted on summer. But with our community participants, it means something different, right? The reason, the opportunity to participate in these studies is meaningful is because, to use their own words, no one usually cares what we think. It's as if they've learned from us, people in universities and scientific community more broadly, a lesson that was crystallized for me a few years ago in this science communication workshop. And that is, there are some people who narrate the world and other people who have their worlds narrated for them. That there are some people who get to have their perspectives be part of the scientific record, and others who don't, and they're always in that latter category. And that exclusion matters, right? The exclusion from the research process has downstream consequences for what society does with research. As Aaron Squire noted, historical exclusivity often has a way of turning present and institutionalized tragedy. Whose story gets told matters. Who gets to be part of our studies of environmental issues matters. And so these are some of the reasons that we've been doing research in these ways, studying individuals and collectives from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of settings. The way that I think about all this now is that when we make decisions about who to include in our studies, how we conduct our studies, we are at least implicitly making some decisions about who matters to us and what aspects of their lives we're willing to consider. And we have to remember that because those decisions have important implications for the knowledge that we create, as well as for the policies and practices that are developed as a result of that knowledge. It affects whether individuals continue to try and go it alone to address things like climate change, or whether we band together and build the kinds of coalitions that are necessary to seriously move the needle on addressing the climate crisis. Doing this work, though, requires strong teams and tremendous support. The work itself is a collective enterprise. So in closing, I just want to quickly thank some of the remarkable collaborators, community partners, students who have contributed to the work I share today, and who have really shaped my own thinking about these issues over the years. And I want to thank the funders who have supported it, including the Atkins Center, which I know is co-sponsoring this series. So thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Is to track occupations of the people that you're surveying, and if so, have seen results that show that certain occupations have similar beliefs to other occupations.
Question. We have not been looking at occupations, because we look a lot at well, all the things around the occupation side. We don't measure itself. We do have some new surveys that are getting ready to go out in the field, so that's something we hope to do.
Question specifically to dig a little bit deeper into the neotoxic communities. So what do you think are the main barriers to provide them with resources to be able to adapt to the content like that? Or kind of focus to their specific needs?
So we did hear the questions about the work on toxic communities, like I said, Taylor and others. What can we do to help them adapt? This is one of the connected this promise I'm going to continue making those, of course. This is one of those things where I think we need to look really hard at what policies sort of put them at risk in the first place, and what can we do, whether in terms of the resources is one thing, to help people with implementation plans. So we can think about tax abatements strategies. We can think about directing new development. So like, I don't have generalized answers, but it depends on like what is happening in that particular place. But something we have to take seriously and take seriously at multiple levels. Yeah.
Question for the concern about the environment. So how do you measure the level of concern to different social groups?
So the measurement of concern is we have a survey battery that puts people on a scale. I think people was a 1 to 5 scale. Where 1 is like concerned, 5 is like children concerned. You are as well as how you think about it. And what we then have is for the perceptions of others, it's you're answering that question for each group, and for your then you're answering for yourself, because we have your demographic characteristics, so we can know how your concerns.
Or students or different greenhouse gases that section. Do you also like how what agree like like constant purposes historic interests like 18.
So the first study that I showed you, we didn't have those measures of how politically active people are. And more since studies with other women's, we're able to look at did you vote last election, as well as experience contacting calling your elected official. The first study we had measures of like before they do that. In the more recent studies, we also have available. There's one unfortunate thing. Many people think of democracy as just voting every 4 years, right? So there's not much in sort of regular, unless there's like so that's sort of a general models of
The one considering policies such as like banning gas-driven cars, for example, you touched on this a little bit about like desired impacts it can have, for example, overseas, certain cobalt miners, but some discussions have also been brought about like that raising the price of cars to some of the cheaper cars being the gas-driven cars, so that affecting like disproportionate or underrepresented communities. So how do you balance policies with things like that without like our desired outcomes?
Because one of the things that does is it forces us to think about what are we already so we have the lots of things are built for house, right? We could build other things, right? We in other places there are public transit systems that are cheaper or free because of how the public structure is set up. So I think because of our default mode of being a car culture, we sort of think of that as one. Cars going to be more expensive one as sort of the only sort of option. When we, I think, can think more extensively, drawing lessons from other places, solutions that we can help. So these things are actually so using big, cheap, alternative system that's reliant, that's one of the things that I'll be curious to follow for the next couple of years, given New York City's current industrial pricing, like running the business. With that is taking that money to then make the public transit system better, which can then make it cheaper for stuff.
Organization, I was wondering if you ever touch base with client organization estimates, and strategizing how to track questions.
Yes. What's your what the for the so in the communication, we quite a few communication faculty who and a bunch of faculty who study things like questionnaire design and all these things. So that's a way of figuring out how to ask the questions. In terms of then the conversation, right, of communities, one of the reasons for designing the research in a way that's tailored from the beginning is you can have some of those conversations with people in the communities you're trying to engage with to figure out like what what are the issues? How are people talking about them? So you can sort of start small and build from there. It's a new way of it's like so much. I get myself.
I think that's similar to I mean, South the US, which makes class and climate change blue.
So yeah, class has come up, I'm trying to think, and there are quite a few studies that tend to find some of that. The other big thing though, earlier I mentioned social trust, right? And social trust in collective action. That matters, right? And what is driving these sort of social trust variables is these broader divisions between groups within countries. So there's these studies looking, there are at least 15 country studies and 16 country studies looking at what's going on and what's predicting willingness to work together on climate change and support policy like. And the collective policy, the collective action and policy support stuff is really most driven by how much do you trust other people in your society. So that seems to matter a lot, and whether that ends up breaking down more by class or race or caste or something else in other countries is function of level of inequality kind of this.
I was wondering how do we work towards eliminating misperceptions that arose from trust?
So one thing is right. So one of the reasons I to include that work in these talks is that people are not aware, and they're not, and so they're going on when they become aware, they're more willing to have conversations. So there's another set of research I didn't include for time's sake, but there's this work by this group at I think it's the group at the Yale Climate Center on just the power of having conversations about climate change. Not only addressing misperceptions, but having these conversations more broadly gets people to figure out actually we have a lot more in common than I thought, and then they're willing to right.
Thank you for speaking with us. I know you focus a lot on collective action, but I was wondering, going back to the individual action, like, do you think there is missing research or people trying to like find a way to make individuals correlate with individual action, especially with like social media and like how they're environmental and like sustainable friendly influencers? Do you think that that is just bad, trying to get individuals to focus on sustainable living and like consumer conscious consumerism, or do you think collective action is worth it?
It's a question I've been thinking about for a long time, and one of the challenges is it's hard for people to know which actions. Right? So one of the things that's really interesting in the behavioral literature is when everyone was studying how to get people recycled. And of course, there's lots of conversations how much is recycling actually. So these things come up a lot, so you can get people fixated in lots. I think done a good job getting people recycled. But then you might ask people who are studying systems, how much does recycling matter? And then they go, well, we really should be doing some other things. And so that kind of thing confuses people and can be demoralizing sometimes. I was at a conference, this is now over 10 years ago, I think, so it's much people who study behavior change. And we're going, well, we study how to get people to change behaviors. We brought in people from the EPA and elsewhere. So which behavior should we focus on? We started getting consensus in part because of some of these larger systems things. So that's not to say that like people shouldn't try. I think we should, and there are things that we can do, but getting a clear sense of what those things are, and then how much they matter, what things once we get to you.
Yeah, so you mentioned that out of a lot of people that you surveyed, like they had bigger concerns like in climate change stuff like rural movements. You know what are the bigger worries people have heard, and are there ways that you can, and so you talk about climate change or how like a public perception of it, how would convince people to make it a bigger concern?
Sure, and then I'll go ahead and ask your question, then I'll do that.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering how like research that you conducted and how the engagement with all these people may have aligned to the notion that you don't always need to be concerned about conversations.
First, question of the sort of rankings. So people are concerned about climate change, but they're thinking about them in more integrated ways. And it actually starts to answer your question as well. That I think we often talk about climate change and the right issues. It's like a single issue thing. But the reality is that because it's so integrated with so many aspects of life, like it's that integrated way of thinking that really cares for both engaging people in conversation about it, and then building that willingness to work together. One of the things I read about sometimes is that universities are set up in doublets. So you study your thing and you don't want to talk to people about your thing. But then in life, engaging lots of different aspects of existence. One of the things integrate these multiple strengths that people have. So one study I was hoping to talk about today, but we didn't finish the follow time, is we have a new set of experiments that we've been running. And it's talking about sort of some very concrete human impacts of climate change. We test the message around asthma and air quality, climate change and health, learning. All of them work. Those work. It's really big way, and I think it's because it's not just climate change in its own. It's like how is climate change affecting all these other things in your life. This these innovative messages are really resonant, and so that's a direction.
I'm really curious about the way in which you like craft and also interpret survey results and questions. Because I know a major issue when it comes to surveys is the way someone like interpret a question and how they're allowed to answer the question, like a 1 through 5 scale versus like you can answer it in 300 words type thing. So how do you decide basically just how to craft a survey and how does it perhaps impact the way that you can interpret the survey results?
You could say this would be small. We spent the whole semester on this very question. No. So the empowering to see the question longer. And what we do in order to make sure or to figure out what we're finding this game is triangulate across different groups, right? So we at least open-ended questions. We ask closed-ended questions. We run experiments with benchmarks that we can compare answers of benchmarks. So throughout by triangulating across methods, diagnosis, confidence now in what we're seeing. One of the things I talked about in the slide, this one is I mentioned the data piece actually is it's much helpful for sort of not truthing what you're studying. And so there's two papers imaged together where we saw some things and qualitative and marginal open-ended discussions that raise this question of what does it suggest about this group, this place, or other people like that. And we did was pull those these out and open and qualitative study. Close-ended survey, ranking these 18 different pulled out these 18 different things that came out, and then asked 1,000 people. We're getting the same type of answers this week. If you're hearing this, also how you ask questions, it gives you how to be true. If you only find it when you this way, then not okay, then you don't waste it. But this is sort of the logical trying.
Sure. This is impacted by, like the brain attack SAT guide research.
Great question. So my view is like I'm gonna keep doing this until I feel and all the messaging that I got from chairs to use, maybe all these nutritionists is working with farm nutrition. And some of my theories also suggest like this working with farm nutrition. So things change every day. But as of right now, this is still important. I still believe in these beliefs and the Buddhist work. We are still living in this institution, and so we should find a way to build after that to follow us. And so I'm gonna keep doing it. I'm not going to play in advance and stop doing it. I'm here. Yeah, so that's my way.
Talk about the disproportionate impacts in communities like air pollution and access to green space. I was also curious, get any insights about the impacts related to weather events related to climate change, like drought, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and if and how those impacts compare to the other areas that you mentioned.
So kind of going back to someone was asking about the methods part, so I was curious to know more about how you've incorporated both qualitative and quantitative studies in your work and what kind of quantitative studies you've incorporated. So I guess like for context, the research I do is primarily quantitative and then climate models, satellites, all that stuff. But I feel like in order to make it matter to people, you need to have that qualitative aspect. So I was curious about how you kind of balance that sort of interdisciplinary approach that is tricky to get funded.
So I'll answer both with let's say the slide and the go to this section. So the first one on weather events and how weather events matter. That's something that we've been looking at in a few different places. So locally, I do a lot of work both up here in New York City and the work in partnership with the city is looking at who might be affected when we have these torrential rainstorms and some kinds of apartments get flooded and so forth. That's one thing. There are heat risks for particularly older people in the city. That's one way of thinking about it. Last year I was in New Orleans, and one of the things that happened there with some recent storms is actually losing a bunch of land to, I forget which hurricane it was. But what that meant is people had to raise their houses a few more feet. Not everyone can afford to do that, right? Like the amount of money it takes to do that, to keep adapting, that has disparate impacts. So for lower income people, that means they're going to get pushed out. So that's one part of it. I know we have one more minute. I promise I'll finish in time. To the other question about incorporating of the data. So in this image where we're at the farmer's market, what is actually happening in that study is we were showing people real-time maps of the air pollution they're exposed to in New York City. Data that is modeled with a professor in transportation engineering. It uses New York City transportation data to figure out how much air pollution is in the city at different times of day. So we're showing that to people using eye tracking software to see what are they paying attention to, surveying them, and had an experimental manipulation about levels of inequality and so forth. So that's how we're combining the data to see how people are responding to this real world data. It's 4:10. Thank you all for coming.